I've always felt that SimCity is one of those games that seems like in retrospect it just should not have been possible at the time it was released. It's a work of true genius, but it also begs the question, how exactly did Will Wright manage to get an entire city simulated on a PC with a minimum of a 386 processor and just 2 megabytes of RAM? Now, technically, we've known the answers to these questions for a while now. The source code of SimCity is open source, and you can still get it on GitHub right now. But of course, for most gamers, myself included, digging into the source code is not a very useful option, and a simpler answer can be elusive. Or at least it was elusive, because a new book has dropped that explains the inner workings of SimCity in a way that is detailed yet understandable. I'm talking about Building SimCity, How to Put a World in a Machine by Chaim Gingold, a designer on Spore and the main designer on the Spore Creature Creator, which, as you might remember, was actually sold as standalone software. This is not the book, because I was sent a PDF copy, but I did read through the PDF copy, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts about it. I do think it is a wonderful book, but also one that's a little bit different from what you might expect based on the title. So, let's get into it. Now, from the title of the book, you might expect that it's entirely about SimCity, and at 464 pages long, that seems like a lot of SimCity. Certainly, that would be one of the largest books dedicated to a single game I have ever seen on store shelves. However, this is not actually what the book is quite about. While the book is focused on SimCity, the game doesn't get a whole lot of coverage within the book until the third part, which starts around page 185. Which is a lot of pages before the book about SimCity talks about SimCity. Now, what is in those pages? Well, the book goes to great lengths to set up everything you could possibly want to know about the idea of simulating a city before SimCity came about. In fact, the entire first chapter of the book is probably not very relevant if you are a fan of SimCity or just games in general, because it's really talking about children imagining how a city works in their own mind, which is important for the context of the book because it's trying to talk about how we think about simulating cities in general. But if you're here looking for game history, then that's probably not really going to be of much interest to you. And I did end up eventually skimming over most of this section because it just wasn't really relevant to what I was looking for. The second section of the book is more relevant to SimCity fans because it starts to talk about the things that inspired Will Wright directly, and does a bit of a deep dive about the different ideas and philosophies that Will Wright was exposed to that sort of molded the way he was thinking about simulating a city in a computer. With that said, though, this is still not really game history, so again, if you're looking for a book about SimCity or video game history in general, those first two sections actually are not especially useful for you. Now, you might be thinking, why would the first two sections of this book not talk about SimCity extremely directly? And the answer to that is that this is really more of a textbook, or at least an academic book. Its goal is not to expose SimCity itself in isolation, although it certainly does provide a lot of interesting details, but it's really meant to provide an entire broader context. And when I say textbook, well, it's not really formatted like the textbooks you might be used to from, high school biology class, but this is very much the kind of book that you would probably get assigned if you are in a humanities class or you're taking a game design class, maybe something specifically about simulating things in video games. It also might be the kind of book that you would look at if you're doing some urban planning and want something a little bit off topic but still relevant to add some spice to the class. I can very much see this being inserted in there. And indeed, this is published by MIT Press, and that tells you a lot, I think, right away about the intended audience of this book. This is not a mainstream book. It's not one of those coffee table books that's talking about the Legend of Zelda for the 50th time, or it has a nice, beautiful cover with lots of excellent art inside of it, although there are some pretty good pictures in it. And I wish I would have had a chance to look at the physical book rather than just the PDF copy to see exactly how high quality it is when it comes off the press, because if it is a high quality book, which again, I don't know because I didn't see the actual physical book, some of the stuff that's in there could be pretty impressive. Now, everything I've said so far might make you feel a little bit down on the book. You might be thinking, why would I want to read this book if I'm a fan of SimCity or just a fan of video game histories in general? It doesn't really have much information for me. And the truth is it actually does have quite a bit of information, because that third section is packed full of stuff. Now, really towards the end of the book is where the explanation of SimCity itself as a video game and how it works on a technical level comes into play. And here Hayam has done a really good job of providing excellent graphs and infographics that really go into detail about how exactly is the game working. And when I talk about how is the game working, I mean things like, how does time actually pass in SimCity? What does it mean for, say, a month to pass in SimCity? What happens on a sort of technical level in the game's code when that time passes month to month in the game? How is the simulation interacting with each other? What are the different elements of the simulation that are calculated on each step of the simulation? It's really broken down in a lot of detail. Now, if you're a big fan of SimCity, this is probably going to be pretty interesting to you. I think that the only people that wouldn't find a lot of information about this are probably hardcore SimCity modders or other fans who've already dived into the source code. If you've not done that, then you probably haven't had the information that is in this book ever presented to you with this kind of clarity. And it really will help you understand a bit more about the game. I also think that if you are a game designer and you're thinking about maybe making a game about simulating a city, it's actually really interesting information. In my prior video about how SimCity works, which I have a link to in the description of this video if you want to check it out, I discussed a little bit about how modern agent-based games, although they tend to work better than the older statistical-based simulations, they don't always accomplish all the goals that you would think they would being an agent-based system. In other words, having all those agents running around in your simulation doesn't always provide a increase in the level of detail. For example, if you play City Skylines to this very day, a lot of the way that is simulating, say, fire risk is not based so much on simulations, but rather on just the radius around a fire station. And because of that, there's still a lot of interesting insights in the original SimCity. Also, I think maybe if you were trying to make a city simulation and you wanted to make it more efficient so it could run on lower end hardware, this probably is not a bad thing to look at either. Another thing this book does get into with quite a bit of detail is the sort of personal history of how Will Wright developed SimCity and the steps he went to both in terms of programming the game and also getting together all the things that you needed to get together to actually publish a game. Because Broderbund, which was initially going to be the publisher of SimCity, actually rejected it. They didn't think it was enough of a game, and it was not until Will Wright got together with Jeff Braun and they put together the game and decided to put it out themselves that the game was able to hit store shelves. This, of course, led to the formation of Maxis, and Maxis ended up being an incredible powerhouse. I think we actually forget how much of a powerhouse Maxis was in the mid-90s. This is a studio that had an initial public offering. Yeah, if we were talking about Maxis today, I think we'd probably have financial YouTubers talking about whether or not it was a new meme stock or something along those lines. It was incredibly popular, and initially the stock went up quite a bit, but that did not last. That actually brings me to the other interesting part, and actually the most interesting part about the personal history of how the game and its successors was developed, and that is the kind of middle history of Maxis. That is after the publication of SimCity, but before Electronic Arts ended up buying the studio. There was actually tons and tons of games published by Maxis during that period, not all of which were developed by the studio, in fact. And as the studio became more successful, there was a lot of business wrangling over how the company was going to justify itself. And, of course, justify that huge stock price that it had at its IPO. The answer to that was they never justified it, and Maxis ended up getting bought by Electronic Arts. And a lot of people will say that Electronic Arts sort of led to the downfall of Maxis. But if you read what is going on in this book, I think it's kind of hard to quite buy that narrative, and it becomes really clear that there's a lot of strange stuff going on behind the scenes, even during the mid-90s when the studio was still publishing a lot of very popular games. And actually, I don't want to talk too much about these various tidbits, but one example I do want to get, just to kind of show you the kind of information that is in this book, I learned while reading this that Will Wright actually didn't have a lot of clout at Maxis at this time. There were a lot of people inside Maxis who were not particularly happy with Will Wright as things went into the 94, 95, 96 kind of period. You might think that developing the game that put the studio on the map to begin with would earn you a little bit of credibility, and I guess for a few years it did, but the problem was that Maxis needed more hits. And Will Wright, he just wasn't a hit-making machine. He never has been. He's an experimental sort of guy. He likes to do things that he wants to do, and he likes to do them on his own time. And that, of course, led to some culture conflicts with the business bigwigs at Maxis, who were constantly pressuring pressuring the studio to put out more games. I was also surprised to see a fair bit of detail about The Sims in this book, details that I didn't know about. Now, admittedly, I'm not a person who's very well versed in The Sims. I have played most of the titles, but I never really looked into the history behind the game. So I was very surprised to discover just how actively Will Wright was pursuing the development of The Sims during this mid-90s period. I assumed that he had gotten the idea around this time, but that he didn't really start to develop it until later in the 90s. But in fact, he was pursuing it in this mid-90s period, and that is what led to a lot of the cultural conflicts in the studio. The last thing I want to say about the quality of this book is that the author, Chaim Gingold, he really knows what he's talking about. Like I said, he worked on Spore, he worked with Will Wright himself, so he has a lot of at least very close secondhand knowledge about SimCity and how it was developed. And he was able to talk to Will Wright himself to get his opinion, and it is reflected in some of the information in this book. There is a lot of stuff in here that I've never heard of before, never seen published before. New information, and even information that is not necessarily new, like how the game works, is explained in a lot of detail and formatted in a way I've never seen before. So I actually came away with an much better understanding of SimCity. And I say this again as someone who made a previous video about how SimCity works. I did a lot of research for that video, and I think that the information in there is correct, but there's still a lot of gaps in there about some precise details of what's going on in SimCity, and this book really fills in those gaps. But of course, does that mean you should buy it? Well, one obstacle you're going to notice is that this has textbook prices. It's priced at $50 for the paperback. Yeah, $50 for a paperback, not a hardback, and $35 if you decide to get a Kindle. I feel pretty certain that these are the kind of prices that are justified by a book being assigned as part of a college course. So that's going to be a little bit hard to swallow, but maybe it will go on sale in the future. Some of these MIT Press books do get bumped down a little bit in price over time. On the other hand, though, sometimes they don't, and in fact they kind of go up in price over time if they go out of print. So if you do really want this book, I would suggest you get it quickly. If, however, you are on the fence about it, well, maybe go for the Kindle version. It is at least a little bit less expensive. Again, this is a book that is not trying to be a mainstream audience. This is not trying to be a coffee table book. This is really very specifically targeted at, first of all, people who want to know very detailed information about SimCity and the creation of it, and two, for people who want to think about city simulations in general as a concept, for people who want to theorize about that. Of course, that's not going to be for everyone, but I can say for certain, whether you buy this book or not, it's great that this book exists because it has new information in it. And that means in the future, when people like myself are deciding to do coverage of SimCity that talk about various historical aspects of SimCity, we have a little bit more information than we did before. And for that reason, I think this is a very excellent book. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.